When I look at the process of making decisions, it goes back to a man from Australia called P.A. Yeomans, and he developed what's called the scale of permanence. And it's things like, it starts with climate, then with land shapes or geography, but it goes through these different things from what is more fixed or more permanent to things that we can change. And towards the bottom of the list is soil. We can change soil. We have difficulty changing the climate. Okay?
Yes, sir.
Because that's the most permanent. We're going to have to adapt to it. There's not much we're going to do about it.
It's Texas.
It's Texas. We're not going to raise yaks there. We're not going to raise bananas there. We're going to work within that context. But we think of it in terms of the biosphere climate. That's the way most people think. But there's also a climate that we work within in terms of our decisions and the way we think. And that's what Lisa, Darren Doherty's wife, she stated before, that the climate of the mind is the hardest to change. But if we acknowledge it, if we realize it and begin to see, then we can begin to change that. We can begin to function. We can begin to be out there observing, being in God's creation, functioning within that, feeding the chickens, milking the cow, working in the garden. Over time, that begins to change. And I think what happens with us many times is something changes even within our own heart. And we begin to care for those animals. We begin to care for the land. And that's the key. That's the key for this to become what God intended for it to be and for your family to be, is care, the application of care. And so we want to take that application and put it into making our decisions, what we're doing on the land. Care is a critical component. And that's not something that we certainly decide to do it, but it comes about as we interact. You think about human relationships. Who do we care for the most? Those we interact with the most. Those that we're with. Those that we have responsibility to husband, to shepherd, to take care of. And that brings in a whole nother concept that we don't normally think about in terms of agriculture. We think about it in terms of pottery or woodworking or blacksmithing, and that's craftsmanship. We don't think about agricultural craftsmanship, but that's what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to participate with God in the crafting of a piece of land so that it can provide sustenance for our family. And there really is a craft to it. Just the same application of care, the application of time, the application of skill, the learning of all those things. It takes time. That's what we want to see happen here.
So you're saying that the climate of Texas is not going to change, but the climate of my mind can change. And that only happens through a relationship built on love and a form of receiving. And that's when you're saying about the perspective and the long-term goal of this land, it's to shape my family. We had a wounded lamb from your son's flock last year, and we nursed him back to health as a family, and it was transformative for us. It was such a simple thing.
Yeah. You learn to care. It pulls something out of you. And I feel like that's what happens to us on the land. And that's what I mean. It changes our perspective, and that process takes some time. And so this is where we spend a fair amount of time. If people can just see how much their own minds, their own perspective, our culture is an impediment to being able to function on the land and with the land, with God's creation. That's an important place to begin, is to understand this is our major impediment. People tell me why they can't homestead. Well, I don't have enough time. I don't have enough money. I don't have a place. Those things can be overcome. Our biggest impediment is the way we think and being able to understand how we function in this biological world within God's creation. Something that Thomas Jefferson said, I am an old man but yet a young gardener. The more a person learns, the more they realize there is to learn in God's creation. It's fascinating. It's ever expanding in terms of what we see, of what we don't know. It causes you to be more in awe of God. And that's the purpose. That's what God planted us in a garden. And that's why He wants us to be part of this whole beautiful creation and see His patterns. And so when we're working on the land, in order to be able to function, we've got to see His patterns. How did He design these things? Instead of taking our industrial, cultural, technological shape mentality and force this into those constructs, we've got to be able to see and function within His design